Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on worker cooperatives and cooperative lawyering. My name is Etienne Toussaint. I am a law professor at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. I also am a board member of the Washington Council of Lawyers. The Washington Council of Lawyers is the public interest bar association for the District of Columbia. We work to promote pro bono services and public interest law, expand access to justice, and create a vibrant public interest-minded community throughout the District of Columbia. We are very excited to co-host this event today with the Georgetown Workers' Rights Institute. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to expose systemic challenges to the US political economy, public interest lawyers and community activists have continued to explore strategies for law reform and community empowerment. In today's panel discussion, Professor Julian Hill of Georgetown Law and law student Priyanka Surapaneni, a third-year law student at Georgetown, will discuss how lawyers have worked with communities to leverage cooperative strategies to respond to the crises of our modern age. Reflecting on their own career paths, they will highlight how law students and lawyers alike can engage in cooperative lawyering and support cooperative movements to promote systems-level change. These efforts aim to improve the material conditions of those who are suffering the most among us. Without further ado, I'll now pass the stage to Professor Julian Hill to help get us started.
Thank you for that, Professor Toussaint, and welcome everyone to this session. Just a few things in the way of housekeeping. There's a question and answering function. If folks have questions that they want to be sent directly to our panelists. There's also a chat function if you want to chat freely among the other participants in this webinar. And just also wanted to name that this video is going to be recorded. And so hopefully that's okay. And just to note that the Workers' Rights Institute will be housing this recording on their website, as well as the Washington Council of Lawyers. And so this will be the first of more conversations around these topics. And so just wanted to kind of go ahead and kick us off with a conversation between me and one of my former students, Priyanka, if you want to come on. And let's just get started with this conversation, which I'm excited to have with you. And so just tell us a little bit about, who are you?
Hey, Professor Hill. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to get started, but I am a 3L at Georgetown currently. So I'm almost done with my time at the university and have had a great experience, but I'm, as you mentioned, was a student attorney in this social enterprise and nonprofit law clinic last semester. Professor Plurhopolis and Professor Malpati, along with you, were a great resource for us kind of bridging the gap as 3Ls between law school and practice. And so that semester I had was really a great insight into taking everything that we've learned over the past 2 years and applying it to and reflecting a little on the type of attorneys we want to be, the type of practice we want to engage in. So that's kind of where I got my inspiration and where I'm at in 3L at the moment, and hopefully looking at my career on the horizon. So I will be joining a firm in New York City after graduation. So I'll get back to your old neighborhood and hopefully get started on spreading the word, especially about cooperative economics.
So go ahead.
So I know that a lot of the clinic students are familiar with your background, but if you just want to talk to us a little bit about your experience and how you got to Georgetown.
Sure. So, I'll try to be relatively brief, but just provide information that might be helpful context for how I got to where I'm at. So I'll start with, I'm the fifth of 7 children, son of parents from outside of Chicago, a small town called Kankakee. And, 2 values that were always instilled in me were, one, very concrete sense of self-worth, as well as a rich understanding of sort of the lies that the world was going to tell me about myself and about the communities that I came from. So I grew up with a really rich appreciation from my mother and the sort of like Black radical love that she embodied that was really uncompromising and unlimited, but also sort of what hard work looks like. And my father was president of his labor union. And so, got a lot of insights from that around corporate structures, exploitation, things of that nature, and also just being a lifelong learner. And so, I studied philosophy at Northwestern and, eventually decided to come to law school because I was really concerned about power and how the law empowers certain groups and disempowers others, particularly as someone who had an organizing background and cared about institution building. And so, I spent a couple years at a law firm, paid off my loans, fortunately, and then, did some worker cooperative specific work at a nonprofit called Take Root Justice, where, I worked with dozens of worker cooperatives in different industries, really trying to create a better life for themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And came to Georgetown to spread the good news and hopefully inspire students like yourself to engage in this work.
Yeah, it's been great learning from you. And last semester, we were your first batch of students, so it was really nice to welcome you to Georgetown. So I guess what I'd like to start with is what are cooperatives and kind of what are we here to talk about today, and how has your experience working in that space informed the type of work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think in order to understand cooperatives, it's helpful to kind of take a step back and put it in context of this larger sort of solidarity economy sort of ecosystem. And put simply, the solidarity economy really tries to center, people and planet over profits, which is what we have with our traditional economic system. And it's best understood, I think, both as a movement, but also as a framework of sorts. And so, there's a World Social Forum in Brazil back in the early 2000s that kind of kicked off this real sincere interrogation of how do we make linkages between social justice issues around human rights violations, and the economic systems that are at play. There was another one in the US back in 2007. But these are all practices that really predate all of us on this call and even this country, this idea of sort of cooperating together. And so, some of the main values of that economy include solidarity, right? How do we think about the value of doing things collectively versus individually, sustainability, and regeneration, and just the idea that we have finite resources and we want to move sustainably. Third value is around equity, right? And thinking about how do we imagine and bring forth a world where, the Black, trans, disabled person who's an immigrant is able to really live a full and meaningful life, right? And making sure that the systems that we put in place make that possible. The fourth one is around participatory democracy and just making sure that folks are able to have the same sort of say that we espouse in our political systems in the spaces where they actually spend the majority of their time, which is the workplace. And then also, pluralism, and understand that there's a lot of variety and ways in which we can move through this. And it's part of sort of this larger ecosystem that really encompasses all types of economic activities. So think about like child and elder care, right, which is often relegated to, unpaid labor a lot of times. Think about land, right? Like how do we cooperatively own land? So community land trusts, the work that Professor Sheila Foster at Georgetown is doing around the commons. Think about the city as commons. Modes of exchange, right? So sliding scale, bartering, where people might not have, cash to exchange. Thinking about it in the context of consumption. So like fair trade, housing cooperatives, et cetera. Thinking about it in terms of surplus and what do we do with that? How do we allocate surplus? And so credit unions and public banks versus private banks and sort of, as part of the production piece is where you have worker cooperatives, right? And so I think it's important to understand sort of how that's all situated. And to speak very briefly around sort of like worker cooperatives and sort of what those are, you're really thinking about, take any business. And so let's say, for example, you have an accounting business, right? You got 10 people. You might have one person who's the owner and then 9 employees. When the profits come in, the owner gets the profits. When decisions are made around what are we going to do, the owner makes those decisions. In a worker cooperative, all 10 of those people are owners, and they participate in the decision making with this principle of one member, one vote. And they also benefit from profit sharing, which allows them to get profits based on the actual work that they do. And there's some other principles as well, but that's sort of the ecosystem and how sort of worker cooperatives fit within it, and some of the underlying values. So kind of giving a little bit of that context, I'd love to hear from you, sort of what drew you to sort of cooperative economics, cooperative lawyering, this type of work.
Yeah, and just hearing you talking about that too, those basic values that kind of underlie this, I think that was the main, the sort of underlying values of cooperatives was the main piece that really drew me to, this concept of understanding how can we address like an asymmetry of information, how can we address an asymmetry of resources, and particularly in our clinic last semester, as we were working through the type of representation that we wanted to provide these nonprofits, you're thinking about how lawyers kind of hold and kind of have a hold of that asymmetry of information, and thinking about movement lawyering, which you brought into our class and raised and discussed with us about being as client-centered and really getting to the heart of these communities and what their needs are in order to best serve them. So I think it's really the values that brought me towards that. And as you moderated a panel on mutual aid during the pandemic, I think doing the clinic at this really pivotal time in our economy, in our society, caused a different kind of reflection, I think, than we would normally have been doing in a regular semester on campus. So I guess thinking about the inequality that we have in DC here itself, that's so apparent to us every day, I think, and talking about bringing the community into Georgetown as a purpose of the clinic. All of these concepts of community, mutual aid, mutual care were something that I didn't really want to leave behind in my pursuit of transactional law. As you start in law school, it's really easy to get into the litigation or transactional tracks. It's really easy to feel like you're restricted in what you can do based on the type of path that you choose. And what I found through our conversations is that I can use my transactional skills while upholding the values that I want to live my life with and I want to represent. So that's truly what drew me to this space. And really, I've just been trying to learn as much as I possibly can. And you've been really helpful in providing students with resources, whatever their interests are. So I'm curious, I know you talked a little bit about your background, but I would love to ask you the same, what drew you to this space?
So thank you for those reflections, and I appreciate them, particularly because it comes from a student's perspective, and I think it could be helpful for other law school students thinking about these sorts of big questions like their career and what that could look like. As it pertains to me and how I got into this work, I didn't learn about cooperatives or cooperative economics K through 12, not in college, not in law school, and so it really took one of my now sheroes and mentors, Jessica Gordon-Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, which talks about the history of African-American approaches to cooperative economics, for me to even learn about this space. And so, in thinking about it, the values resonated with me, this rich history resonated with me, thinking about my father's work as sort of a union organizer, my mother's experience as a worker, and seeing myself first as a community organizer and kind of second a lawyer and other things. When I read that book, and this was in my second year of practice when I was out of law school, I was trying to make connections between that and some of the organizing work that I was doing, which was with Black Youth Project, or BYP 100 at the time. And I immediately said, I got to figure out how to get to this work. And so, a practice point for folks who do end up going the firm route, pro bono was the first thing I thought. I was like, how do I find a way to do this work via pro bono? Not to wash away the sins of the work that I was doing most of the time, but really just to kind of think through a transition. And was lucky enough to connect with another one of my sheroes, Carmen Huertas Noble, who's a professor at CUNY's clinic. And they really were the premier clinic in New York City around cooperatives. So I literally cold emailed her. I said, hey, let's be friends. Let me do free work for you. It didn't work out ultimately, but I got connected to the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives, which is in New York City. And through that was going to fundraisers for organizations that do incubation of cooperatives like Green Worker Cooperatives and Center for Family Life. I went to law-related workshops that were conducted at the time by the Urban Justice Center, their community development project, which is now Take Root Justice. And so I was just trying to learn as much as I could. And literally a year later, an opportunity opened up. And I found this out later, but dozens of people had applied. And, because I was in the space, and I was like the random law firm Black guy with the bald head that was just around, people knew that I was taking this seriously. And so, that's those are the things that were going on. We had the financial crisis that was going on. And even now, as I reflect on some of your remarks around the COVID-19 pandemic and just the ways in which it's forced me to sort of interrogate things like, monopolies, right? And the ways in which corporations have captured a lot of markets, and not just political institutions, but actually like their whole markets. I mean, you might be aware of the fact that you have Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. There was a congressional hearing some months back interrogating like this idea, are they too big? I mean, you have this really bizarre dichotomy between, I remember reading the New York Times one day and it was like stock market is doing record numbers. And then you have record numbers of unemployment claims, like literally in the same day. And so, just realizing that the world that we live in right now, the system that we have causes so much suffering. And being someone who, again, who's grown up with the sort of values that I have that are very community related, I said, how can I use the skills and the gifts that I've been given, the opportunities, right, that aren't because, oh, Julian's so smart. Like I have, friends at home who could easily been doing this work, but for different circumstances. And so that's kind of how I got into this work. That's what keeps me into this work. And yeah, just kind of a community care and just wanting to combine my organizing and my legal work to bring forth just a different world that people deserve. So that's a little bit about me. But why don't you, I love if you could continue a little bit on the thread from earlier, like what's something you think law school students could be doing, to engage in this work? What would 3LU tell 1LU in terms of engaging in this work that folks should be aware of?
Yeah. One main thing that I think ties into this is particularly us students who are fortunate enough to be in DC. I think just keep connected with the community around you and keep connected with DC and it's really easy, I think, to get into this academic environment and think about things in the abstract, or I'm doing research for a paper right now, doing a historical survey, but really thinking about what you see, I think, hurting or lacking in our own communities, wherever you are at law school. I think a good way to maintain perspective is to ensure that you're not forgetting about the DC outside of our campus walls or the community outside of our campus walls. So I think that's an overarching theme that I would definitely tell myself, my 1L self. But I think another part of that is really drilling down to your skills, your strengths, and what you're passionate about. We did a lot of this last semester, a lot of reflecting, and I think that only helps distill down kind of where your values and your skills can align. So doing a lot of that reflecting, I think, is super important and a huge reason why I would recommend a clinic to any student who's in law school, to be able to think about the world practically using the skills that we've kind of learned in this bubble, has been super illuminating, and I think challenging also, because you kind of have to challenge yourself to think about what am I engaging with in these classrooms that I can take outside with me. But also just, I think reading, like you said, that's something that's super applicable to no matter where you're a student, or if you're a student, if you're a practitioner now, just trying to identify with those values where you can fit in and your curiosities lie. Because I think a lot of what I'm hearing from your journey too is you were led by those curiosities and those kind of desires to change the world, your corner of the world, you know, as best you can. So, and one thing that I think really, you know, allowed me to take a leap is doing pro bono work through the school. So in particular, I think something that really opened my eyes was some pro bono work I did for a local clinic, and just kind of understanding the sort of legal information that is in demand and the kind of resources that lawyers can provide to the community, whether it's DC or beyond, and just trying to mix in as much of that practical experience of what does being a lawyer mean in my world. I think those are all things that I find to expand a law student's thinking beyond just the academia that they're participating in. I guess I'm curious also of how we can connect, you know, the idea of cooperative economics and worker cooperatives. A lot of, I think, can sound very idealistic, you know. Where can we find kind of ways as lawyers and as practitioners to integrate it into our worlds and make those incremental changes that we see? You know, where can we start, and how can lawyers kind of lead that charge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I want to start with a point that you mentioned earlier, which is around being rooted somewhere. I think in part because I do organizing work, my first question when I'm in any space is where's my political home? Who are the people I'm struggling with to think through the issues that the folks in our community are dealing with, who are sharpening my analysis around different issues, like around patriarchy, right? As like a man or male identified person, like that's something I'm continually struggling with and being agitated around and sort of unlearning, right? And so I think part of that bleeds into being able to do the work as a lawyer, particularly when you're doing it in community. And I think also just kind of thinking about learning relevant skills that are going to be useful when you're engaging with folks. And so it's one thing to say, yes, I'm going to have a client and do sort of transactional work, but there's work that can be done around research, you know, for different issues that are going on. There's, you know, even in those spaces where you're working with folks as a transactional attorney, when I've done work in coalition, you know, I work on worker cooperative governance documents and nonprofit governance documents all the time. The questions are pretty similar, right? Who are the members here? How are we making decisions? What happens when bigger decisions come up? You know, what's the structure? How are we allocating the work? And so, you know, learning those sorts of skills and being able to support, and I say support again, and not sort of come in sort of domineering when people are coming together and sort of building coalitions. I'm thinking about policy work as well. Is a space where there's some utility for lawyers, particularly in this space. There's not a ton of states that have worker cooperative corporation laws or worker cooperative association laws, so there's space in that context. And then obviously, you know, doing some actual advocacy. One of the things I did when I was at my former place of employment, Take Root, was I would go to hearings and testify and go to town halls, you know, all at the request of the folks that we were organizing with. And so those are some things I think people can start thinking about in terms of both getting more rooted in community and sort of building the values and the practice of cooperation, because I think this is something that goes beyond the work for most people, for me, for most of the lawyers who are doing this work. And so I think being rooted in community and also just developing these sorts of skills that you can use. And I'll just note as a little plug that, this semester our clinic, we're working with 2 worker cooperative clients, you know what I mean? And so there's that actual opportunity to engage in this work, very, very closely. And, the hope is that we can continue to do that work because we just need more lawyers doing this work, because if we want to, again, build an economy that has these sorts of institutions, we need to, unfortunately, under the constraints that we have with the laws that we have, to be able to help support folks in putting those together.
Great. Yeah, I think starting with an event like this, that we can really name worker cooperatives and the role that kind of lawyers can have in this sort of space, I think is important to ensure we're vocalizing, our interests in this space and the conversations that need to be had. But I am curious, I shout out Professor Cook. I'm in his cooperative seminar right now and doing a bunch of research for that. But I guess I'm finding that co-ops do not have the type of backing in the United States that they do abroad. And, of course, Jessica Gordon-Emhart, and it has been huge in kind of raising this, particularly in the context of Black communities. How can we, have these conversations and spread this word, as you said, using your skills in policy, but where does the education kind of begin? Because this is a conversation that's being had all over the world. I mean, the UN has even brought up cooperatives, in as early as 2012 as kind of worldwide solutions for development. So what are we missing here in this conversation?
Yeah, so I think there are some resources that are out there, I think both nationally, and I can just name drop some organizations to both get just a general understanding, but also some of these spaces have some actual legal tools and some legal documents that folks can wrestle with in the context of being an attorney. So there's a national formation for worker cooperatives called the U.S. Federation for Worker Cooperatives. So folks could check them out. There's also, I want to say it's the National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA-CLUSA, which also is a national formation that's more for cooperatives generally. And I think, to the point that you mentioned before around education and reading and learning, those are some great resources. Democracy at Work Institute, which has an office based here in DC for folks who are here. You've got folks like the ICA Group, which is an organization that provides different types of support in the context of conversions. And I'll just name what that is just to give people context. One of the things that cooperative developers, some economists who are friendly to cooperative economics are thinking about is, even before the pandemic, was this idea that you have a lot of business owners who are going to be retiring soon, right? So the silver tsunami is what they've been calling it. And different formations throughout the country have been thinking about how do we create and facilitate both the technical support as well as the funding to facilitate those businesses converting to worker cooperatives. And so it's functionally an acquisition. So the owner would sell the business to the owners and it would convert to a worker cooperative. And so, the ICA Group, and there's some other groups that are doing that type of work. And so, so that's like some national stuff that folks could be thinking about. I think regionally here in DC, getting acquainted with some of the ecosystem players here. And when I say ecosystem, I'm thinking about coming from New York, right, which was the first city in the country whereby their city council put in the council budget line money to support worker cooperative development. Right, so who does that money go to? What are the different players who are very useful in the context of taking a co-op from idea to fully functioning, right? And so, so some of those types of players include sort of like member organizations or folks who are kind of like a glue that can kind of facilitate. And so there's a DC Cooperative Stakeholder Group here in DC that folks could look into. There's also organizations that do financing work. such as like WAKEF and Capital Impact Partners. You've got folks like the law school clinics who provide technical assistance. And so, so there's some resources there, so on and so forth. And so just kind of wherever you're located, looking at some of the national formations that might give you a sense of, okay, who are the lawyers doing this work? What are the formations in my town? Like Chicago has a relatively vibrant network. The Bay has a relatively vibrant network. Of course, New York City, there's places scattered throughout the South, Detroit as well. And so thinking about it from a learning standpoint, thinking about it from the context of these are organizations you could potentially intern with, right, as well. Your 1L summer, 2L summer, et cetera. These are folks you could just be in conversation with just to learn about some of the ins and outs from a career standpoint. And so those are some things that, folks could be engaging in now to prepare themselves to potentially, shift into that work and to just shift into this idea of like cooperation and generally, even just on the community level. Mutual aid societies, well, I shouldn't say societies, mutual aid initiatives in different cities have cropped up. Join your local mutual aid initiative. Sometimes there's political education that's included there. But yeah, I think it kind of all goes back to finding that sort of political home. There's like One DC here in DC, again, is another organization that used to work with the Cooperative DC movement that was, I guess it was in motion a couple years ago and it's starting to be revived. So yeah, just kind of doing the work on the ground, talk to folks who are doing the work. And once you get one person in that city, it's just about networking, which is the same thing I did when I was in New York.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's great that we're able to have this conversation under the umbrella of the university, but it's almost like to encourage everyone to have true experiences. I know it's hard with the pandemic right now, but just trying to connect with the community as much as we can and get back to the community as a source of okay, what do members of the community actually need and want, and getting back to their desires as far as how we can turn to development and turn to autonomy and kind of have more sustainable economies. So thank you so much. I think it's hard to figure out where to begin. And I know I definitely had difficulty with that. So just browsing the internet as we do and trying to find resources, I think will help us figure out, and if this is something that's interesting to people here today, that's a way to think about it.
Yeah, you want to shift to some questions that we got from folks?
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah. So the first question that we have is around like how large is the legal market for these services, organizations that do legal work, what are some of them? And, aside from the legal work, how much proselytizing and political education about these forms do the organizations do? So that's a really good question. I touched on this a little bit, but aside from some of the hubs that I mentioned before, there really aren't that many legal service organizations that are doing worker cooperative work. And I'm pretty sure that that's intentional for reasons that might be obvious. Think about even New York City, right? First city to have a budget line. You only really have maybe one organization full-time that has a team that does worker cooperative work, which is Take Root Justice, where I used to work. You've got CUNY Law School that does that work as well with Carmen, who I mentioned before, and Missy Risser and some other folks. And then you've got like legal aid. I think they have a person that does some of this work, and maybe a person here and there in a couple other places, but like that's New York City. So I can probably count on one or two hands the lawyers. And so you can imagine what it might look like in other places. So there's definitely a dearth of folks doing the work in legal service organizations. Some of those organizations I mentioned, I'm in New York, there's also Sustainable Economies Law Center out in the Bay. There's also Detroit Justice Center. I know they have a couple folks doing that work in Detroit. And I know there's some lawyers in the South. I'm less familiar with those folks, but there's some folks out in the South doing that work as well. And then in terms of the last piece of this question, a lot of these organizations don't engage a ton in the sort of the psychology work, right? The political education piece around co-ops, in part because there's sometimes other people in the other organizations in the ecosystem that are just better situated who do the education. But it's crucial. It's crucial both from the standpoint of people coming into the work. And so you have incubators, for example, that will do, let's say, like a 12-week, 8-week program where they bring folks in, they do some of the political education, they talk about marketing, they talk about business plans. They'll bring in sometimes consultants like myself to do the legal piece, to do the work around that. And then by the end of that process, the idea is that they're able to operate. So they'll do some of the political education, but what's also crucial is the ongoing political education, which I think is one of the 7 principles of the International Cooperative Association, which I didn't quite mention. But one of them is like education and training in an ongoing capacity. And so it's not just about the original 7 members, but what happens when you bring on another 7? Like, how are you making sure that they're aware of what's going on? Because the structure only does so much. You can have a worker cooperative that is anti-Black, that is patriarchal, that is ableist, and that's not necessarily doing us necessarily any good either, right? Particularly when we think about some of the solidarity economy principles I mentioned before. So, so that work is really important. And, it's a big shift for someone to go from every 2 weeks, I come, I get my check, I go home. Next 2 weeks, go to get my check, I go home, to now being a decision maker. And that's, something people aren't used to, but it's also something people have to kind of grow into and be supported in. And so there's a lot of work I think that needs to be done around that. So I really appreciate that question. Second question on here was around, how would you answer the legal realist critique that adjudication is a flawed and limited tool for advancing systemic reform? Wow. Okay. Yes. So funny thing is, when I went to law school, I actually wanted to be an alien tort statute attorney, which is basically this old statute that typically allowed foreign individuals to sue other foreign individuals in US district courts for the violation of certain human rights. A lot of legal practitioners have been trying to use that same model for corporations, with the idea that, XYZ oil and gas company is polluting local water sources. They're financing the local government to quell uprisings that are leading, in ways that are going to be, violating people's human rights. And so I thought I wanted to do that work. And so I'm not gonna, I understand that critique, but I also, understand that there's harm reduction, there's other pieces to that work that's important. I'll just say for myself, again, as someone who's big into organizing and considers themselves an institution building person, that just wasn't the lane that I wanted to take. In part because for me, the build work is the work that I really want to engage in. We have another question. What would you recommend for law students whose schools do not facilitate pro bono opportunities? I mean, some of the things I mentioned before, but I'll highlight 2. I think one is encouraging them to network and build relationships with some of the organizations that I mentioned before and some of those practitioners. And I think 2 is when, in the context of, I guess 1 is sort of doing some of the reading, some of their own knowledge building around that work. So then that way, when they are reaching out to folks and opportunities come up, because like I said, there really aren't that many organizations that do this work, folks are as best situated as they can to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. Like I said, I didn't get into this work until after I had graduated, so I'm not probably the best situated to answer that question as robustly as I might had I kind of gone through that process, but those would be some suggestions that I would have where your law school doesn't provide those opportunities. Last question. How do you balance different work goals? Let me see. How do you balance different workers' goals, especially when looking for client-centric movement lawyering? For example, in 10 worker group, 8 of them want to be involved in decision-making while 2 really don't want the responsibilities. So that's a great question. One of the things is that worker cooperatives, one of the principles, again, under the ICA is they're open and voluntary. So the idea is that we want people to be able to become worker owners if they want, but it's not necessarily something that they have to do, right? So there are worker cooperatives where you have some employees that don't necessarily want to take on those responsibilities and obligations. And so, so for those workers, you might just say, okay, we're going to be independent contractors, we might be part-time employees, we might be full-time employees. And then the cooperative becomes an employer, and you have to sort of think about the labor law issues that, depending on how it's structured anyway, you'll probably need to wrestle with in any case. So we got about 3 minutes left. Take these last couple questions. Have you experienced workers and other stakeholders being reluctant to accept the cooperative model because of socialized and politicized notions that socialism is bad in America? You know, most of the groups that end up coming to me are a self-selected group, I'll say, right? Oftentimes, because of the motto that we did in my former organization, we were in partnership. And so the incubators, they had the folks that they brought in, and then they would sort of go ahead and give us those sort of clients. And we didn't have to necessarily engage in those types of conversations. So that hasn't been my experience. Let me see. And then could you address some of the other barriers to growth of cooperatives, like limits on access to capital? Yes. Access to capital is a huge issue. There's this formation called Seed Commons, which is a national formation that's a group of a bunch of different CDFIs that provide financing specifically for worker cooperatives. The Working World, I believe, is based out of New York. I think Capital Impact Partners might be affiliated with them here in DC, but that's a huge barrier. There's certain barriers around procurement and just the ways in which they're not able to benefit sometimes from that. And then just lack of understanding that government entities might have of these institutions. So that was our last question. I'm gonna pass it. So I'm gonna first say thank you to Priyanka. I'm gonna pass it to Professor Toussaint to close us out.
Thank you, Professor Hill.
First and foremost, I just want to thank both of you, Professor Hill, Priyanka, for your participation today. This was fantastic. It was educational. It was exciting. It was interesting. You know, I'm still trying to sift through all of my notes, but I just thank you for sharing your experience, sharing what you've learned from those experiences, and also giving us some insights in how folks can get involved. You know, the work that I do at UDC Law School, especially with our community development law clinic, we're also deeply enmeshed in these same issues. We do a lot of work with worker cooperatives, but also with housing cooperatives. And you know, one of the things that I wanted to elevate that you mentioned is the critical need for more people to get involved, the dearth of services, not just within the legal community, but also without. And so, you know, there are so many stakeholders that work with these organizations, and there are so many other issues that are engaged. And finally, I would urge students to who are watching to encourage your professors to talk about these issues in the classroom. It's an excellent way to think about some of the normative subtext in contract law, tort law, et cetera. You know, it allows you to talk about anti-capitalism and how that might relate to lawyering. And it allows you to talk about access to justice more generally and the role of lawyers in law schools in promoting justice. So thank you so much. This video will be shared across social media platforms for others who are unable to attend. And finally, I will just plug the Washington Council of Lawyers. If anyone is interested in getting involved, you can visit our website, wclawyers.org/join. We welcome law students and any lawyers who are interested in supporting public interest lawyering. So thank you so much for this fantastic event, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. I'll take care.